Welcome to the Red Sneaker Writers Podcast. News, interviews, and writing tips for people who are serious about having a writing career and want some practical knowledge to help them achieve it. Your host is the nationally best-selling author of more than 50 books, William Bernhardt.
Hello, Red Sneaker Writers. What a pleasure to be talking to you all again when there is so much goodness out in the world, the publishing world, and the world at large. Of course, I'm still buoyant about the rollout of my new novel, Final Verdict. Have I mentioned that title on the podcast before? It's Final Verdict, which is the 6th Daniel Pike book. Seems to be doing all right. It's still got its #1 bestseller flag on Amazon, and I've been told that this book has racked up the largest number of pre-orders I've ever had in my entire 30-year publishing career. So obviously, I'm pretty excited about that. I was on Amazon this morning, like all obsessive writers do, checking to see what your ranking is and to see what reviews have been posted. And I saw a review this morning where somebody gave it 5 stars and said, this book is better than chocolate cake with a side of butter pecan ice cream. I just thought, could I have that stamped on the cover of every book I write for the rest of my life? 'Cause it's never going to get better than that. Speaking of web pages, was I speaking of web pages? That may be a false segue, but whatever. Speaking of web pages, please go check out the new website for WriterCon. That's writercon.org. WriterCon, of course, is the annual writers conference that I co-host in Oklahoma City. It's always Labor Day weekend, which this year is September 3rd through the 6th. And we have a brand new designed website. I told you we're going to be rolling out some changes this year, and this is the first. So check it out and see what you think of the website. We've got a lot of the speakers up there now, though there will be more. A lot of the agents you can meet with one-on-one. You can see the general programming. The schedule isn't up yet, but you can get a general idea of what's going to happen and maybe even pre-register now while you can still take advantage of the early bird price. It will not get any cheaper than this. So, you might want to take advantage of this. The conference will be held in person in Oklahoma City, but we will also stream the entire thing. So even if you can't or don't want to travel, you can watch it from home. For that matter, all the sessions will be online for a month after the conference, so check it out and see what you think. That website is writercon.org. That's WRITERCON.org. And even if you don't think you're going to go, you should. What's the deal? But even if you don't, I would love to hear what you think of the new website design. I paid a fortune for it, so come on. Let me know if it's working or not, okay? My interview guest this time is Stephen James, terrific teacher and terrific writer. He's been on the podcast before, and I could not wait to have him back. This time, talking about what I and I think most people think is his specialty, the psychological thriller. But first, the news. My first several news items this time out are really updates or follow-ups to previous news items that I've covered on the podcast. For instance, Spotify, which, as you know if you've been listening, is trying to get beyond music, which apparently isn't as profitable as they want it to be, and get into the spoken word world, starting first with podcasts, which they've made a big investment in. Some question about whether that's paying off for them yet, but they've done podcasts, and now they're also doing audiobooks. They have just launched a whole series of audiobooks of classics. And of course, when I say classics, what I'm really saying is public domain books that are well known, but they don't have to pay anything for the rights. So you can listen to books like Jane Eyre, if you haven't heard these before, The Awakening by Kate Chopin. If you didn't have to read it in high school, well, here's your chance to catch up. For me at this point in time, as a guy with a master's in English and reading constantly, I've kind of read all these myself. but not everybody has. So maybe this is useful. Here's one thing I really like about these. They're accompanied in some cases by commentaries from professors who will explore the history and the themes of the books. Kind of like if you're like me, one of those nerds who read the introduction in the Penguin edition, in addition to reading the book, this is made just for you. I do think that's a nice addition. Other publishers, I might note, are also putting out what some people are calling aural guides, aural meaning AURAL, that will accompany listeners as they do things like cooking or meditating or gardening, three of my favorite things. If you want to know more about that, there's a great article at the Wall Street Journal, if you can get past the paywall, written by Katie Dayton. Another update. The Authors Guild has asked the Department of Justice to stop the Penguin House acquisition of Simon & Schuster. As I've said before, this deal has been completed in principle, but they have to go through regulatory this and that's, and I think it's going to happen. But the Authors Guild has claimed that this will give, let's just call them PRH for short, okay? Penguin Random House will give them control over 70% of the literary and general market share in the United States. Other people, like Sarah Grace at Publishers Lunch, have disputed this. I don't even know where they're coming from. 70% of what? They certainly don't control sales. They don't control that much they control a huge amount of what's being published, but not that much. So I don't know where that's coming from. And frankly, I don't think it's going to make any difference. It's not going to matter, is what I was saying. The Authors Guild, it's nice that there is something that resembles a union for authors, but the sad fact is they don't have any clout. They never have. I'm not aware that they've ever stopped or caused anything from happening or to happen, so I doubt this is going to slow down the merger. Another follow-up, I've been talking about how 2020, despite the misery it may have inflicted on the world at large, was good for authors and publishers. Book sales were up. But I feel like I should make the point that that was not true for everyone. And here I'm quoting again Publishers Lunch, this time Michael Cater, who pointed out that although adult book sales were very much up, audiobooks were up, that wasn't true in all genres. For instance, school and library sales in print saw sharp downturns. Well, you can see why that would be. The schools were often closed or going all online. Libraries were closed. Subsidiary rights deals were also down. That primarily has to do with foreign rights sales, but may also include movie, TV, and other subsidiary rights. But that's down, and that can be harmful for authors because, at least for people who have been around a while and are particularly successful, that can be a portion, maybe not the largest, but a notable portion of their income. I do want to make the overall point, though, that overall it was a very good year for writers and publishers. Okay, another follow-up. You may recall me talking about the CASE Act, K-A-S-E Act, which is basically designed to create a small claims court for authors making copyright claims, intellectual properties challenges. Well, given all that's been going on in the world in the last few months, you may be forgiven if you didn't notice, but this was actually signed into law by the president on December 27th, 2020. So this is actually going to happen. Now, this is a board that it'll be a forum within the U.S. Copyright Office that can hear claims of up to $15,000 per claim or a total of $30,000, which, and you can represent yourself. You don't have to have a lawyer, which doesn't mean you shouldn't, but you don't have to. That's why I'm analogizing it to small claims court. I think this is a good thing. It's not going to work for every claim, particularly major ones and major authors, but I know some people who are seeing that people are, using pseudonyms and pirating their works online and seeing how long they can get away with it. This is a way to protect yourself. Speaking of the government, which I kind of was. That was a more valid segue, right? Anyway, speaking of the government, you've probably heard that we've got a second round of COVID relief, and maybe a third very soon too, but the second round created a second round of PPP loans, that is Paycheck Protection Program loans. What's become clear to me, though, talking to friends and writers, is that not everybody realizes that you may qualify, especially if you're publishing yourself, if you've created a company for it, or even if you're just working on some kind of DBA, doing business as situation, you might well qualify. The touchstones may be whether you were doing business during the certain time period and whether you have employees. But even if you're the only employee, that's still an employee. I will strongly urge everybody who thinks they might qualify to go to the website. The Small Business Administration has released applications online, but it'll expire in about a month. So go online now and see if you may qualify. This money is available, and I think writers are every bit as worthy as anybody else. So check it out. Speaking of people who self-publish, you see how I just keep rolling with the segues? I mean, really, that's kind of brilliant in its own way, he said modestly. Anyway, talking about self-publishing, if this is something you've been thinking about, but you're not sure whether you want to do it or not, there is what I thought was a terrific analysis of the advantages by an author called Ilona Andrews on her website. That's Ilona, I-L-O-N-A, Andrews. She breaks it down, in percentages and dollars and cents, and explains why she, even though she's a successful author with a following, is now self-publishing. I will add one caveat that her analysis really only works if you've already built up a following, one way or another. If you're starting out fresh and you're self-publishing, then you can expect to have, some time of hard, heavy-duty marketing before you're anywhere near the numbers she's talking about. But I still think it's an interesting and I'm recommending analysis that I'm going to recommend to you. Okay, more news. Barnes & Noble Press has now announced that they're going to raise their flat royalty rate for ebooks to 70%. Again, news for self-publishers. Barnes & Noble is now paying 70%, which, if you do this, you already know that's what Amazon gives you. If you price it $2.99 or more, it's what Apple gives you. And Barnes & Noble, trying to compete, is now joining the club. If you're wondering why you might want to self-publish, let me just tell you that for years, writing for Random House for the Ballantine division, I would, in most cases, get 8%. Big publisher in bookstores, 8%. And there were some situations where it could go 10 or even in rare cases 15 for hardcovers. But what we sold mostly were paperbacks, and that was 8 to 10%. Now, ebooks are a little bit different, and publishers there's no real uniformity yet, but they are paying more, even in New York, for ebooks. But nobody's paying 70%. Of course, 70% of nothing is nothing, so you got to sell books for this to matter, but 70% is pretty inviting. And one last word, for those of you who may enjoy writing fan fiction, even though you can't really sell it because you don't own the intellectual property rights to Indiana Jones or Harry Potter or Harry Styles or whatever you're working about, there's a site called Archive of Our Own, which is probably shoulder and shoulder with Wattpad for having the most, for being the most popular fan fiction site. It's certainly up there. People were reading this site so much they literally crashed the website. During the last few months, they've soared, and in December, they saw traffic grow from 1.4 billion in September to 1.7 billion page views last December. Now, just to be clear, if you're writing with somebody else's intellectual property, you're not going to be able to sell that commercially. But what I think many of these, some people just think it's fun and they want to do it, and That's a way to get people reading your books. But the more strategic red sneaker approach would be to use this to build an audience and then take them with you when you write a book with original characters, which may be in the same genre, may even be somewhat similar to what you were writing before, but without someone else's characters. That may be a path you want to explore. In my writing tips section, I wanted to talk a little bit about the first page of your book, and I'm really thinking of novels, though I'm not sure it's any different for nonfiction. I was listening to a podcast this morning, ostensibly about writing, although, you should be on this podcast, right? If you really want to know about writing, I am I'm so self-congratulatory this time. But anyway, my point was that in the podcast I was listening to, they claimed they were going to explain why first pages matter, and never got to it. Guy basically just said he wrote his first page, and from there it was just, easy, because you red sneaker writers know how easy writing is. And I thought, okay, if you're not going to do the first page thing, I will. Look, I think the first page, and from there, the first chapter of your book is the most important one in the book. We could argue all day about whether the first page or the last page is the most important. They're both important. But if the first page doesn't succeed, nobody's going to get to the last page. So I'm going to say this one is the most important page in the book. You must draw your reader in. I don't care what kind of book you're writing, popular fiction, literary fiction, nonfiction, the first page must draw the reader in. This is why you see nonfiction writers of histories or biographies often jumping forward time-wise and having the first chapter be something people know about, or something famous or something really interesting, and tease that in the first chapter, and then in chapter 2 go back to where the story actually begins chronologically. Similarly, in a novel, the first page needs to be something exciting that makes people want to read more, that tells them this is going to be a terrific read. Stick around. It's only going to get better from here, right? You probably know the mistakes that starting writers often make with the first page. Don't start with describing the weather. Agent sees that, they've already stopped reading, because that's Amateurville. Don't start with a description of the landscape or the sunrise. Don't start with some flashback to your character's childhood. Don't start with a lot of exposition. The reader can wait. They don't have to know everything there is to know in chapter 1. What you need to do is get the story going in the most interesting, engaging way possible. And that doesn't necessarily mean melodramatic or highly explosive things need to happen. I've said this before, what you need to make people wonder is, oh my gosh, what's going on? This isn't right. How can this be happening? Unanswered questions, mysteries. That's what you want to present on the first page just as quickly as possible, because these days people are unlikely to stick with a book that doesn't hook them right away. Why should they? There's zillions of books out there. They can download a new one to their iPad in about 10 seconds. There are a lot of books selling for free that seem perfectly good, or if you've got a Amazon Prime membership, you can get a lot of good books. You cannot expect people to stick with your book. Once upon a time, they might have thought, well, I paid for it, I better read it. Nobody thinks that anymore. They're only going to stick with your book if you make them want to. Now, granted, if you're writing, say, something more in the vein of literary fiction, people may have a little bit more patience, but I still don't think you can expect people to stick with a book they are not enjoying in one way or another. Certainly that's true in popular fiction. People are looking for a good ride. You've got to give it to them. In my books, in, say, the Dan Pike books, the legal thrillers, so they better thrill. If you've read any, you may notice chapter 1 does not typically, there was one exception, does not typically introduce the main character. What it does is portray something really, oh my gosh, which is never a gunfight or a bomb going off. Those are, done to death and really not that exciting because you don't know the characters. What you want to portray is a likable character in a dire, tough situation and make people wonder what's going on, what's going to happen next. And then once you've hooked them, chapter 2 can introduce Daniel Pike and start the story. And eventually, the significance of the first chapter will become clear. But the most important thing is that you've hooked the reader. Some variation of that is going to be true in all genres. I know you're not all writing thrillers. If you're going to have a romance, you may need to have the couple meet in chapter 1, but don't just have them meet. There's a reason why people talk about the meet cute, or sometimes people say the cute meet, but you get the idea. There's got to be something memorable about it, something that makes you like both characters and makes you root for them to get together. In science fiction or fantasy worlds, you may have to do some world building in chapter 1, but in the midst of that, you need to present a likable character who is in a tough situation, because that's what draws people in. Ask yourself this question when you're planning that all-important first question. What do you like best about a book? What is it that hooks you? What was the last really good book? Not just okay, not just something you read because somebody told you should or you had to, but a book you really enjoyed. What drew you in? What made that book go down so smoothly, get read so quickly? Think about what that was, and then put that in the first chapter. And then revise it over and over again, tightening it, strengthening it, perfecting the language till it sparkles like a diamond. Sometimes at the end of a book today, publishers will like to put a teaser for the next one. You'll see that in the Daniel Pike books too. But here's the reality. Because those teaser chapters have to be written so far in advance so that they can go in the previous book, more than once I've significantly revised those teaser chapters before they appeared in the next book. So, they don't really even match what was in, except in the biggest, broadest way. Certainly word for word they don't match the teaser, but whatever. That just shows that you're paying attention. You should do that to all your book, but particularly that first chapter. You cannot revise enough. Make it sparkle like a diamond. Make it draw the reader in, because then you may not only be building a reader for that book, but for every book you ever write. My interview this time is with Stephen James, the acclaimed author of more than 30 books at this point, I think, including the critically acclaimed Bowers Files series. 11 books to date, I believe, psychological thrillers. It includes opening moves and many, many more books. That's really his strength and where he's seen the most amazing success. And so on this interview, I wanted to ask him, what makes a great psychological thriller? This is what he said. Stephen, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Bill.
Glad you could make it. You have developed a sterling reputation, not only as a writing instructor, but as a writer. A lot of your books have been, for want of a better term, you correct me here, but I'm going to say psychological thrillers. Is that fair?
I mean, I think so. Yeah. Psychological thrillers. Some people say, suspense thriller. It's all good with me. But yeah, one of the things I've really gotten interested in from the start was this idea of, deepening the psychological suspense and trying to do it kind of very often with a high concept thriller. And so it's been an interesting and fun journey. And I've always loved stories with a twist. So, Bill, when I started my first novel, I was like, I've got to have some sort of a twist in here. So that's become something I've tried to develop into each one of the books, is some sort of a twist that readers don't see coming.
Well, easy to talk about, hard to actually do, right? Or for that matter, you mentioned high concept books. I mean, you've written more than 30 books. How many high concepts can there be?
Well, okay. So first of all, it is sometimes difficult to find something that hasn't been done before. And so I've tried to, develop ideas where I'm like, what would happen if, and then I just try to take it into a direction people haven't seen before. And so, that's a trick. And as far as coming up with twists, I can kind of give you a little bit of the background on how I try to do that within the stories is basically I look for things that have a number of different characteristics. First of all, it has to be unexpected, which seems logical if it's a twist. If we see it coming, it's not unexpected. It also has to be inevitable. And I think this is where people tend to write stories with, quote, twist as one or the other. Like it's too predictable or comes out of nowhere too much. So that when readers get to it, they're either like, I saw that coming like 100 pages ago. Or they'll say, come on, that's not even fair. Like that's your twist, that I don't buy it. And so coming up with something that is both unexpected and inevitable is huge for me. I also want something that will escalate the story and be revelatory. In other words, reveal aspects that reveal added meaning to scenes that already occurred the readers hadn't been aware of. So those are the four things I keep in mind. Unexpected, inevitable, escalatory, and revelatory. And as I develop those stories, I'm often asking myself, well, how can I add something that is unexpected, but that makes logical sense, or that adds up tension and so on?
But how do you make those twists seem inevitable as opposed to, no, that doesn't even make sense. I'm not buying that. That comes out of nowhere.
Well, sometimes it requires me to go back to what I've previously written and shade things in one direction or another.
Right.
Plant seeds, clues, red herrings, and so on. So I think you know this, but I don't plot anything out. I don't outline at all. I write completely organically. And so some people will say pantser or plotter and so on, but I always just refer to myself as an organic writer. And
it does sound classier.
I don't know about, but so I never know what the twist will be when I start the book. I don't know how the book will. I've never started a novel knowing how it will end when I've started it. And so, some people will say, "Oh, you shouldn't write that way because you might write yourself into a corner." Mm-hmm. Well, over the last 15, 20 years of being a novelist, I've realized that the best ideas for me always wait in the corners where I write myself into a corner and I'm like, I don't know what's going to happen next. Well, neither do readers. And so then writing your way out of the corner in a way that fulfills those four things we spoke about earlier, inevitable, escalatory, and so on. Finding your way out of the corner then allows readers to say, man, I didn't, see where we were coming. So I never warn people against writing into a corner. I always tell them the first thing you want to do is write yourself into a corner because that's where the best ideas await you and the best twists will come.
That actually makes a lot of sense. I'm very much a planner and outliner. And more than once have I gotten to a point in the book and thought, something needs to happen here. We need a twist. We need something exciting or unexpected. And then I try and think of the most completely unexpected thing that could happen, write it. And then, of course, I have to go back and figure out some way that unexpected thing makes sense.
Yeah, you do need to build up the scaffolding of believability, so that it doesn't come and then readers, don't buy it. So I think, whether people plan out their books beforehand or write them organically as I do, or discovered as they go along, I think being receptive to the story, as you just mentioned, is huge, is really important. So as far as those who plan or plot or outline and so on, as long as they're receptive to the story and they're saying, you know what, I have this idea now that I didn't 6 months ago when I started this, book, that I think would be a really interesting route to go. Well, I feel personally like that's probably a good idea, is to explore that instead of that fear will often drive us back to an outline, that fear of the unknown. Oh, I don't know what's going to happen. But often those moments kind of offer us the best, the best directions for stories to go, where readers won't see where it's, won't anticipate, but will definitely later appreciate.
Mm-hmm. All right. I want to talk about structure a little bit if we can.
Sure.
I just warn you up front, this is probably going to be like a knockdown drag out, because my first book on writing was called Story Structure, The Key to Successful Fiction. But yours is called Story Trumps Structure.
Yeah, exactly.
Which possibly means there's more than one path to a good book. But what do you mean by that? What do you mean story trumps structure?
Well, I think that if you talk to most people who believe that structure is important to a story, and you said, well, what if you broke a rule? What if you actually had 4 acts instead of 3? Or what if it was a 2-act play or a 2-act story? Or what if you introduced the main inciting incident, 30 pages later, and it was a better story? I mean, I'm guessing, but I don't know for sure, but most people that I've talked to who believe in structure so dearly would say, well, no, if it's a better story, go ahead and break it, the rule. And so my take is, well, I would rather teach storytelling principles than a storytelling pattern. So instead of so much of a template to follow, I always try to teach people what lies at the heart of a story well told. Mm-hmm. And then to allow them to explore that. I think some people get into, I don't know, so forgive me for not having read your book, but some people, some people get very, caught up with the idea of 3 acts or 4 acts or whatever it might be. And I just feel like there are a lot of examples of stories that don't follow that pattern. And so I try to say, okay, instead of starting with the pattern or template, let's start with the story. And maybe it'll fit into one of those kind of templates and so on. Or maybe it won't. And so that I love drag out fights about story and structure, but
well, if you got a story, of course, that's gold. But I think sometimes those structural templates, you mentioned the 3-act structure, well, not the only way it can be done, but they can be helpful to people who are trying to write a book for the first time. And it just seems immense. I got to fill 400 pages and 100 characters and plot, it breaking it down makes it a little bit more doable.
Well, in my view, I try to say, what is a story? And then the number of acts or divisions it isn't as essential in the way that I look at stories, but so what is a story? Well, a story at its core is a pursuit, and so this is what I think is true as far as stories go, is that stories are pursuits and they're always driven forward by unmet desire. So identifying the desire of your character and then allowing for a crisis or calling event to, sort of initiate the story. Something goes wrong. They try to resolve it. They fail. And that may go on for 50 pages or 200 pages as things escalate and get worse until they finally look like there's probably no solution that we can come up with on the spot. And then there is a moment, of darkness where it all seems lost, and then it's resolved in a way that is unexpected, inevitable, and so on. And then typically there's a transformation of the situation, the character, or the relationship. Anyway, so I always look at story in that way, right? And so I leave dividing it up into acts to other people. It's just not my specialty. And in fact, I have no idea how many acts any of my novels have. Except one.
I don't know it.
They're all three. There's one that I'm pretty sure has 9. There's one that I'm pretty sure has 5, and there's one that I'm pretty sure has 2. What's that? What did you say?
I said you and Shakespeare. All the plays are 5 acts, right?
Yes, his are 5, but that one, broke nicely up into 5 sections. So there are 5 section breaks, and so the story moves that way. But I'm not here to dispute with someone that a certain story has 5 or 3 or 2 or whatever. And it's just my goal is really to say, okay, understanding what lies at the heart of a story, how can we shape one better regardless of the number of acts and so on that it might have? So a lot of people find it helpful to do that. I personally, it's just not in my repertoire to go in that direction, Well,
what you're doing must work, because you've got more than 30 books out there, and really a fairly brief period of time. When was your first book published? About 13, 14 years ago?
Well, I've done, before I ever wrote a novel, I wrote quite a number of nonfiction books. And so I've really only done 17 novels. But I've done other books of short fiction, nonfiction, educational books, and so on. So I guess, my first book, which was nonfiction, came out in 2001. And my first novel came out, I believe, in 2007. So I've been writing, since the mid 90s. I started writing for magazines. I wrote for about 80 different magazines over the years, and then started writing nonfiction books and eventually writing novels. Just kept telling bigger and bigger stories. And finally I was like, I've had enough writing short stories. I've got to write a big story, So it grew, and
well, it's turned out really well. Those are fantastic novels. Stephen, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Bill, and good luck with staying safe and healthy, and also in all of your writing projects.
Thanks, you too. Thank you again, Steve, for that terrific interview. I'm just looking forward to having you on the podcast again sometime. Or maybe attending WriterCon, which, let me remind you again, has a brand new website. Please go check it out and let me know what you think. That's writercon.org, WRITERCON.org. Until next time, keep writing. And remember, you cannot fail if you refuse to quit.